Welcome to the Big Calm podcast. I'm Tara Palmer, the founder of Big Calm. I'm a marriage and family therapist with over 15 years in private practice and a lot of experience helping a variety of people with emotional and relational challenges. While that experience is important and helpful in shaping the ideas we'll talk about here on the show, it is my work of learning to mindfully operate my own nervous system that will make your time listening to me and the Big Calm team relatable. Whether you find yourself stuck in the same old frustrating patterns, unable to keep your calm, or just wishing certain parts of your life could be better, we've got some great stuff for you. Each episode contains good, everyday nervous system informed material that can make all the difference. Thanks for being here with us. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Big Calm podcast. I'm Tara Palmer, the head coach of Big Calm. And today we are excited to kind of get going with a new theme. Our last couple episodes have surrounded these ideas of building an inner circle and then kind of trying to sort out in this world where we're all kind of flooded with a lot of demands and maybe kind of trying to sort out when too much of a good thing is still too much. Like, how do we make decisions that are going to support our deeper needs for connection and fulfillment and balance? And at the end of the day, you know, we're all about kind of building this nice, strong foundation of nervous system regulation to support everything else that we do in life. So we've just been reflecting on how difficult it can be to find the answers to those questions if we don't first have the answer to maybe a question that is kind of a prerequisite in the sense of if I don't quite know who I am, if I'm trying to still answer that question, who am I? How am I going to find the answer to maybe some of these other questions? So that will be the focus of our conversation today.
All right. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Scott Palmer. I'm the guest host and appreciate you joining us. So let's jump in and have the discussion around who am I? How do I figure out who I am? Some of those things as it relates to the nervous system and finding and becoming sort of the better or the next version of ourselves. So first of all, let's maybe just open it up with some of like the core problem, and what do you see sometimes with folks and some of the struggles that they have in terms of sorting out who they are, how do they exist in the world? What do you see a lot, Tara?
Yeah, I guess maybe I'm just going to start by backing up a minute and talking about how I think this question shows up in our lives, maybe at all different times and in different developmental pockets. And so, you know, that there's kind of that teenage angst kind of an experience where we're all starting to sort out the answer to that question, maybe for the first time in a certain way. And but that it seems like it kind of resurfaces every so often in our lives. And that kind of transitioning between one version of ourself and the next is just a part of the human journey. And so I just wanted to lay that as kind of a backdrop to the conversation today. To normalize, I guess, that we do find ourselves in the middle of this question at times, and I'm not sure that we ever find a final answer. And then I guess kind of what are the things, the themes, you know, that kind of people bring to this question. I think that's just a huge question. And so looking at, I think, I guess I'm going to just jump right to the nervous system in terms of like what layers of life contribute to it becoming difficult to answer this question is if I am living a life where there's a lot of maybe like survival requirements, I'm going to have a harder time accessing the quality of connection to myself that I need in order to be able to answer that question. And so starting with something really basic of like our physical safety. If I'm not in a physically safe context, I don't know that I'm sitting around kind of contemplating the meaning of life and this more complex relationship with myself. So I think it's things like that, you know, that I might hear from people of they need to, let's say, a young person make a decision about a career path, but if they're not first safe in their environment, trying to access the inner knowing, kind of the layers of that would be needed, are going to be difficult. Um, yeah. So maybe I'm going to let you jump back in, Scott, and kind of direct my thinking a little bit on that.
Sure. So we've got a couple of layers here. I think one, I heard you talk about sort of the different places maybe in life, from teenage to maybe the classic midlife crisis to maybe different end of life or later life kind of development. And then I heard you also kind of talk about the safety pieces there, and how it sounds like there's some prerequisites to quote unquote, finding oneself, if you will. So maybe let's talk about this sort of life stage thing first, and then we'll jump into the safety. So do you see, I think whenever there's a transition in life, I'm going to assume that that's a natural point in time, whether it's from high school to college or college to the first job, midlife, maybe after you've been married and kids, and maybe kids are transitioning. Kind of what do you see as some of the major like differences and similarities as people kind of struggle with these different things? Do they all look the same if it's a 40-year-old or a 20-year-old, or do they tend to look a little bit different, and what's driving that?
Yeah, I guess, I think I'm going to go into, we were talking before hopping on the podcast today just about maybe the overlap of Maslow's hierarchy for all of the listeners familiar with that. And so Maslow's hierarchy is just kind of, I won't get deep into the specifics of it, but it is a theory that would suggest that our survival needs need to be attended to first in life before we can kind of move up this chain of evolution in our personal development, or into a self-actualized relationship with ourself. And so that self-actualized relationship being, this deep connection we're talking about, where I can answer the who am I from a pretty complex place where I live comfortably with myself in the world. And so I bring that up just because of these developmental places you're talking about, that I guess I tend to think that when we're making these shifts, we're really having to maybe kind of create a new map around the different layers of how am I getting my needs met at those different layers. And so let's say a young person who is, heading off to college for the first time, and, all of the safety, security, food, clothing, shelter, all of those kinds of things that have been maybe to a large extent dependent on parents at that point, they're starting to become this new shift for like, how am I going to take care of those parts of my need? And that if I haven't maybe laid the groundwork for some of those basic levels of need, I'm going to have a harder time then coming up into the maybe higher levels of the pyramid, and answering the question of like, who am I, in the sense of what am I here to contribute, or what has meaning for me, or what are my values, or those kinds of things. And so I first, need to know that I can afford my ramen and my Rice Krispies as a college student. And so if I don't have that part figured out, I'm probably going to be a little bit compromised on figuring out what's my major, or how are those things going to work. And I think that, again, kind of like looking at the developmental stages, I think the same thing becomes true at other ages and stages of our life, where, we're sitting in the middle of becoming empty nesters here this fall. And then what does that mean in terms of where I've been investing my energy or creating meaning in my life? And so if I just talk about that for a minute personally, as a mom, a lot of my heart has gone into our kids, and will continue to, but the amount of that energy that's required, given what they're accessing in terms of their own independence, all that's going to be shifting. So then where do I go with that energy now? Where will I apply that energy kind of as I'm moving forward? And so I think it's questions like that, right, that people are going to encounter, whether it's because of becoming a parent, empty nesting, a divorce, a loss of an important person, like all of these different things can kind of be a catalyst to those transitions, I guess, between versions of ourselves.
Okay, so I'm tracking that, and then so it sounds like there's some discomfort. There's maybe some, if I'm hearing you right, some like core safety needs. At the basic bottom part of it, we've got food and shelter, and just really fundamental, can you survive stuff. As you move up there, up the ladder a little bit, you've got relational connections and community, and all the way to self actualization at the tippy top of the pyramid. What what does that discomfort look like for people? How does it play out in either your therapy practice or in the nervous system? What does that look like in practical terms?
Well, I think again, kind of if we're talking about, I'll stick with this theme of, people are young people heading off to college or just trying to create whatever their path is, not necessarily college, but a bridge into their young adult life. And what does survival look like? And so if I don't know how I'm, again, going to do the food, clothing, shelter bit, that's going to be, as a general rule, fairly anxiety producing. And so then some of my, going back to our earlier podcast, some of our protective energies are going to kind of start coming up in our system. So the sympathetic nervous system energies of fight, flight, freeze, and fawn are going to maybe kind of start to be a little bit more present. Depending on how my system is kind of programmed or patterned. I might also find myself struggling a little bit with some more collapsed or depressed types of energy as I'm just kind of trying to deal with those types of stressors. And so I think the level of support we have, both in terms of ventral energy coming into our nervous system to help create that regulation. So there's that internal support. And then there's also the external support of, arguably a child who's coming from a home who has parents who can help them intentionally create that bridge and have support so they know kind of like the bottom's not going to fall out, is going to have an easier time regulating kind of through those experiences. So the difference between maybe like discomfort and challenge versus panic is going to have a lot to do with, again, kind of the level of support available. So there's the internal support and the external support. So.
And I would imagine, I'm just guessing here, but do you see do people get more anxious? Do they get depressed? Do they tend to find a new, bounce from job to job in search of meaning, move from relationship to relationship? Like, what does that look like? And kind of what, are those good things? Are there healthier ways to sort of navigate that as we create that? You called it a new map. What do you see in terms of being healthy and creating that map?
Okay. And so maybe I'm hearing you ask, how do we go about creating the map in a way that's healthy? Is that kind of what you're...
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So I think, to the degree that we can be aware of our nervous system and we can be accessing internal states that are more rather than less regulated, we're going to have a much easier time with that, because a part of what happens if we get into more of the fight or flight, or collapsed kind of energies is our higher level thinking parts of our brain are kind of going offline. Some of those energies of being able to sit with myself and be reflective and contemplative and just kind of drop in and be with, what do I want for myself? Like, what is this really about for me? And so even simple things of, if we're talking again about like young people and maybe the jobs that are accessible to them when they're first getting going, would I rather work at Target? Would I rather be a landscaper, like a crew member kind of thing? Would I rather work in fast food? The answer to that question in a more mindful, kind of informed by a little bit of that who am I experience is going to only be available if I'm first in a nervous system state of safety. Otherwise, I might be inclined to have a little bit more of a grasping kind of energy in my system where somebody comes along and says, hey, I really need somebody to do this kind of work for me. And because it's there and I have that immediate felt sense of a need, like, oh, how am I going to pay my bills? I grab it.
Yeah.
And so it's a survival strategy, but it's not necessarily that mindful approach where I first consult myself. I go inside and I know kind of like what's going to be the more useful approach for me, and ideally being able to kind of see maybe how a given experience is going to be a building block for some of what else I might want in my life. So I don't know if that quite answered where you were going, but
yeah, I just I think all of us have probably observed healthy and less healthy responses to different transitions, like the classic midlife crisis example of the guy who maybe gets like the convertible and a younger girlfriend because he's trying to sort out life and feels like there's something wrong maybe with what's going on, and that doesn't, I don't think that's a good healthy coping strategy. And I've seen, all of us, I'm sure have examples of people who navigate that really well and people who navigate it less well. And I wanted to just probe a little bit. I think you talked about there's sort of there tends to be some excess energy there, nervous system energy, as you're trying to sort that. You just got a lot to deal with, and the nervous system is maybe a little bit revved up. We've talked in previous podcasts about sort of some strategies maybe for lowering that rev and getting into more of a comfortable kind of sustained ventral type place. Do you see that working well with people, or do people need to find different outlets to work with that energy that are maybe healthier? Is it some sort of combination of getting ourselves calm and doing things like increasing exercise or finding hobbies, or like what should people do? Because I think we all have that experience of having that charge, and it can be hard to figure out what to do with that charge, especially when it's something that's really big, like strategic life decision kind of stuff. It's not something that's going to go away in an afternoon. So what do you do with that charge? What should people be doing?
Okay, so maybe I'm going to talk about the charge again a little bit first, in terms of, I think at times in these transition times in our life, a part of where that charge for a lot of us, maybe not everyone, originates is kind of in that experience of uncertainty, not knowing. Most of us like to have a certain amount of control, if you will, over like, how are certain parts of our life going to work? How are some of my needs going to be met? Those types of things. And then if whatever system I've previously had for getting my needs met, finding fulfillment, those kinds of things are starting to shift, I'm going to be faced with dealing with a little bit of that uncertainty. And so in your example of maybe kind of like a middle-aged person going off and buying their convertible or whatever is going on there, that might be taking the shape of like a restless feeling energy. Like, I'm not satisfied. I can't quite find this fulfillment. And then that higher level energy is maybe in that example, I guess this person is like reaching out, trying to grab something that makes it feel better. And so I'm going to kind of differentiate, I guess, between, we can all learn how to shift our nervous system states in ways that feel good for the moment, right? Mm-hmm. And so that person might feel great in that moment. I just bought my convertible. This is amazing. I'm, summer, and I'm having a great time with my convertible. And then I found this, new young person that I'm dating, and they're bringing all kinds of this like maybe fun energy into my system. And if my life has previously been feeling just kind of like, I'm just kind of like going through the motions, life is feeling a little bit kind of dead and just not great. That's maybe the type of thing we find ourselves doing if we just want to access like a feel good state shift, right? So that feels good for the moment, but it might not be a very big picture outlook in terms of, but what am I accomplishing for myself or the long haul, where maybe over the long haul, had I played that out a little bit, it's like, ooh, I kind of did myself in there. That actually doesn't align with my values or who I am or those kinds of things. And so, so coming back to the, what do I do with this higher level energy part of it? A breathe. I guess is kind of like my starting place, is that I think we have to learn how to regulate kind of through those experiences in our lives where things are feeling a little uneasy. They are kind of uncertain. How do I stay with us and kind of like tolerate it? And a huge part of that, I think, is always going to kind of come back to something as simple as breathe. Because when I breathe, and I have these deep, like deeper breathing patterns, my nervous system starts to know I'm safe. And so even though I'm uncertain, I'm safe and uncertain. And versus if my nervous system doesn't know that I'm safe as I'm kind of making that transition, now I'm going to end up kind of managing these like much higher energy levels where maybe I'm bumping up against some panic energy. And then again, my ability to really like be with myself, notice why would I buy that convertible? Because buying the convertible isn't necessarily a problem, but it's a problem if it's a problem. And it's a problem if it's trying to fix something for me that that's not really an authentic solution, right? And so it's just all going to kind of come back to how do I access, in our nervous system language, the ventral energies, the safe and social energies in my system, so I can be present enough with myself to notice, what am I looking for? Like, what is the who am I question? What is that searching for in life? And how do I start moving myself maybe in a meaningful way toward those types of things rather than in kind of a reactive quick fix kind of a way? Because if I'm doing the quick fix, I mean, again, it might feel good for the moment, but it's not going to ultimately take me into the deeper answer to that question where I can transition into that new version of myself that's going to support the next season of my life.
So is a big part of this then, as we're facing some of these big questions about who I am or major life transitions, being sort of comfortable with the discomfort and being able to live in that and sit with it long enough to not come out of a reactive place as I jump into things? And if so, how would you counsel, like a client or someone who came in and said, like, I'm not sure if I should do this thing or not. I've got some excitement and some energy there. I can't quite tell if it's healthy or not, and whether it makes sense for me to, move to another state. I've always wanted to live down south where it's warm. Like, should I do that? What kind of advice would you give to a client or someone who was facing that kind of dilemma?
Okay, so I'm going to break that down. I think there were a few questions in what you were saying there. And so the piece of like, do we need to be able to tolerate being comfortable in the discomfort? I think regulated in the discomfort, absolutely, right?
Yeah.
And then part of what was just kind of like popping up in my head randomly as I was actually just chatting with a friend earlier this week, and we were, I guess, kind of both exploring certain parts of our own lives where it's like, ooh, like a part of me wants to be able to jump ahead and know the answers of like, how's this going to turn out? I want to know the answer to this part of my story. And we were just discussing how that desire that, so often we want to know, gets in the way really of like living our lives in the present moment. And so how do I live in the present moment? And she had brought in a poem, and I'm not going to be able to recall the specifics of it, but it was basically kind of getting at like, how do we learn to live life in the questions? Because life really is lived in the questions. It's, we find answers, but that's not where we live, right? It seems like no sooner do we find a set of answers maybe, and the next set of questions pop up. And so we have to kind of be able to live in those in-between spaces. And that a lot of times that living in the questions and that maybe kind of contemplative energy is a part of what then informs how we get to an action that is more integrated or linked up with kind of those deeper desires related to who I am. And then you had said something about excitement and energy, and I got a little lost there.
Yeah, just trying to differentiate between. So there's there can be sort of anxious energy or dysregulated energy, and then there can be just excitement and what I would tend to frame in more of like a quote unquote positive type energy. And I think I know I personally have had a hard time differentiating between those things sometimes in the past, and I would imagine that other people maybe struggle with that sometimes too. And just curious about maybe if you see that as a pattern, and how do you coach or guide people towards like teasing that apart and figuring out what's what.
Okay, got it. Yep, you were talking about kind of that idea of somebody coming and saying, "I want to move out of state. What do you think?" And is this like excitement that's informing something that's a part of maybe kind of that continuous evolution of I'm finding the next version of myself, or is that maybe like an impulsive move?
Right.
And how do we sort all of that out? And so I would say, again, we've got to access enough of that ventral energy to be able to sit with ourselves and maybe kind of like sit with the important questions of like, well, why would I move out of state? What am I hoping to get out of that experience of moving out of state? What am I going to sacrifice, if anything, by moving out of state? Can I make this move in a way that's aligned with my maybe core values and priorities? Because if I have to sacrifice like a top priority or value in order to move out of state, then I want to be careful, right? I'm probably not staying in alignment with myself in a good enough way to have the moving out of state be something that's really going to fit well for me in the big picture. So I think we have to zoom out. We have to really sit with it and notice why we're doing what we're doing. And if the reason I'm moving out of state is to access a sense of adventure, but I'm going to throw my financial self under the bus in the process, I better stop and think.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's a lot of pathways to adventure, though. So when we sit with these questions, we sometimes find like, what is that part of me looking for? And there's a lot of pathways to access an expanded sense of adventure. It doesn't have to mean moving out of state. So if when we start putting that big picture together, we recognize like, I really can't do that without throwing other parts of myself under the bus, then I, when I know what a part of me is looking for, I can, it doesn't have to be all or nothing, I guess is kind of what I'm trying to get at. And so it's like, oh, well, moving out of state isn't going to work. I guess I just have to go back to the doldrums of my boring life. Like, we don't want to send people there either. So when we recognize it's that sense of adventure, then it's kind of like, okay, well, what else would do that for you? How else could you access that right here, right now in your current lifestyle? And so I think that's a lot of words. I tend to do that to explain this, but those are big things that I would tend to say help us distinguish is this impulsive, or is this like an excitement that's kind of a part of that deeper current of change taking place in my life. As if it can't stay connected to the different parts of me in a meaningful way, then I got to slow down.
Yeah, I love that. A couple of things that you said are really interesting. One, I think we all tend to have a grass is greener kind of mentality when we're looking at the future, because we tend to focus just on the positive things and what could be, and you haven't lived it by definition if it's something you're going towards or it's the future. And so you don't see the nuance of like, so I'm moving from a really cold climate to a really warm climate, for instance. That's great in January, but is it awesome in July when it's, right. 130 degrees in the desert or whatever in the new place, and it would be 80 degrees and comfortable back home. And so just that jumped out at me because I see a lot of people have this very like, I understand where it comes from. I do it. I think we all do it. We have this very like almost naive view of how something perfect is going to be perfect on that other side. And there's no such thing as perfect. There are only trade-offs, and kind of what you said, and those trade-offs may be worth it, they may not, but there's no such thing as a perfect. And so that really jumped out, I think. And I see the more mature people, the people that I tend to value their perspective more, have a little bit more of that nuance too, right? Where they can kind of see advantages and disadvantages in everything. I think that's really critical to maturity and probably nervous system health too, right? So we don't get too revved up one way or another.
Yeah, and some of what you're saying, I think it just like as you started talking there, I was like, yep, doesn't that just come back to that same place of like, how do we stay comfortable or regulated in the context of what's uncomfortable? Because I think we can all just get ourselves in so much trouble if we are moving through life expecting to be comfortable all the time. Um, and so there's a huge difference, I think, between like staying regulated, again, kind of like at least in that good enough way where I feel safe inside and I might feel, ooh, like this is a little uneasy. This is a little, oh, like just, yeah, uneasy to sit with this change taking place or not knowing the answer to some of these things. But also maybe it's a rich opportunity to sit with some of those things that are kind of pulling on my system in a certain way. They're getting me to contemplate life again from an angle of like, oh, what's going to be most meaningful to me. And so really living intentionally is going to come out of, in a lot of ways, our ability to sit with that versus our, like if my highest good is always my comfort, I'm probably going to compromise a lot of things in my life to constantly be trying to access a quick fix.
Yeah, I see that all the time, and certain mental health conditions like addiction, where people are looking for that quick comfort, source of comfort, and not willing to do some of that deeper soul level work that it takes to live with that and to transform that and turn that into something positive. So that's a great call out. I wanted to dig in another thing that it seems fairly common with, particularly maybe more like the midlife, quote unquote, midlife crisis thing, is this idea of like, I need to go away. I need to be alone to find myself. I gotta go on. I think of like Cheryl Strayed, her novel about the Pacific, was it Pacific Crest Trip, PCT, and kind of and certainly she underwent a significant transformation, but certainly there's lots of other things in between there, between staying where you are and going on a whatever it is 3-month solo hike. That notion of being alone and finding oneself there, is there something to that, or do we do better if we're in a relational context as we're trying to sort this stuff out? And maybe it's not so good for a lot of folks to be alone as they're dealing with these things.
Yeah, I mean, per usual, this is, it depends, right? Like it depends on the person. Oh gosh, that's tricky. I would say for a certain type of person with a certain kind of background, that going away, whether it, requires a Pacific Trail kind of a 3-month long experience or some bigger breakaway from the life we're currently living. Maybe not, in most cases, but do I, especially like, let's say for people who have a history where their sympathetic nervous system tendencies are to move more into that fawning kind of a pattern. They're maybe do a lot of accommodating. They're kind of big people pleasers. And so a lot of how they've found their sense of self is in making other people happy, right? That if enough of our energy goes towards patterns like that, or even fight patterns, I guess, where I feel like I have to fight to like, I don't know, like stand my ground in the world or to not let people walk all over me or whatever it might be, that then how do I access the deeper knowing of who am I, and really find myself? So if I strip away the like, well, I don't know, what if I don't concern myself with making people happy anymore, not in a way where I don't care about people, but in a way where that who am I and what do I need also gets to factor into that big picture of the flow in my life, that may be pulling away for a period of time to create more contemplative spaces, more spaces where I'm not getting caught in that old pattern of just trying to make people around me happy. It might bring me into some of the questions between me and myself that I need to start to answer. It might give me room to think or to breathe so that I can reflect on, like, what is it that's going to matter most to me if I'm no longer caught up in that as my primary operating program. So, but that said, I think, we go away. Maybe for some of us that would need to be mindful of creating spaces like that. I think most often, in order to fulfill some of what we find, we have to come back into connection. And so we might, in our going away, we might be actually increasing our connection and our relationship with ourselves, which is hugely important to all of what we're talking about here. But then I typically need to bring that back into relationship with others, because that's a part of how we create meaning and purpose in the world. And so I think it's kind of a both and exactly what that looks like for a given person in their journey, I would never presume to have the answer to.
I appreciate that, because I'm always skeptical too when you'll see certain guru types or advice givers who'll say like, "Oh, this is the key," and immediately raises red flags for me, because I really am highly skeptical that there's one key for everyone. And I think what you're saying is it just really depends on what's the need, what are you trying to get out of it, is that sort of the right prescription for what's going on in your life for that particular person at a given point in time.
Yeah. And maybe, I guess, kind of even coming back again to that notion of, am I choosing something from the current is pulling me toward that? Like, that's a part of where I feel like I need to go to find my answers versus the impulsive, I got to get away from here. Right. And so if I'm getting away as an escape, and I stay in that escape kind of energy, I doubt my answers are there. Right. And versus if I'm really making this mindful choice of, I have just never really created a space to be completely with myself, and I need to just really be with myself in a way I never have before. And I can do that without throwing other parts of myself under the bus or hurting important people in my life, then have at it,
Yeah.
And so I think it's, again, just really got to be informed by the individual.
Makes sense. I know we're talking about, bigger life stuff, but I got some advice related to jobs one time that was super valuable, and it was essentially what the person said was, don't leave a current job, just to leave it, but make sure you're going towards a new job. There's some excitement, there's opportunity for advancement, it's interesting to you, something like that. So don't leave stuff, go toward something. And of course, in life there's exceptions to that if you're in an abusive relationship or something like that. But in general, I think this idea of being attracted to something versus trying to just get out of Dodge and sort of hope it turns around makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think I guess my mind went when you were kind of talking about that, is kind of how that both and so often exists in these different places where we're kind of evolving as people. And so if I'm leaving just escape, I'm not even thinking through where I'm going toward. That's where I head next might be as much of a problem as what I'm leaving behind.
Right. Right.
On the other hand, if I'm oftentimes we're both leaving and going toward, right? And so I might be like in the example I was giving earlier of somebody who has spent a lot of their life in people pleasing patterns. They might be leaving certain, I guess I'll just stay with patterns kind of behind, where they're not going to be interacting with people as often. They're going to be kind of going toward more time in their relationship with themselves. So they can be contemplative. They can kind of find these answers, but it's both, right? I'm leaving people pleasing behind, and I'm moving toward this deeper knowing in my relationship with myself. And so I think being able to kind of hold space for the tension in those places, but making sure we're not doing things kind of impulsively or I guess the nervous system, like in a reactionary way. we're rarely going to find, unless the tiger's in the room, or
Mm-hmm.
like you said, we're in an abusive relationship. But even then, ideally, we want to be moving from the lack of safety in the abusive relationship toward safety in even a shelter, right? Like we want to
Yes.
have somewhere we're going to land safely so that we can then contemplate what comes next. Because if I leave one unsafe environment for another unsafe environment, I've really maybe just made my situation even more complicated, or certainly no less complicated.
Yeah, that makes sense. You want to get to that place where you can have sort of that clear head and that regulated nervous system. That's probably the magic combination, right? So I can think clearly and I can do so without that dysregulated energy kind of shaping my thoughts or pulling me in places or in ways that are either painful or premature to what I should be doing.
Yep. Yeah, and then this is kind of bringing me, I know before we hopped on again the podcast today, one of the other things we had talked about was just kind of like, how do we, and you kind of referenced it earlier, how do we access that? How do we access that mindful state when we're in the middle of these places? And like I would say, especially if we're maybe on the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy and we're really struggling with kind of just the food, clothing, shelter, safety type of things in our life. It's trickier. It's just trickier when we're in those
Mm-hmm.
places. And I would argue that it's not impossible. And so, one of the things, once we're adults, this isn't true for children, but once we're adults, we can start to mindfully notice one of the, like, I would argue, the key relationship in our life is going to be the one with ourselves. And so, as a little person, I don't have the ability to think in those ways. But as an adult, if I can come into noticing how do I interact with myself, I've got a huge pathway for starting to regulate, because between me and me, I can start offering myself support. And depending on our backgrounds, we might have patterns where we're actually engaged in some pretty routine, like inner bullying. And one of the interesting things with our nervous system is it tends not to differentiate very well between what's coming from the inside and what's coming from the outside. Like if I'm being bullied, I'm being bullied. And so if I'm really hard on myself, if I tend to be self-critical, if I'm kind of self-neglectful, my nervous system's going to know that. Versus if I can start kind of noticing, oh gosh, there might be all kinds of reasons I learned to relate to myself in those ways. Maybe I had people in my environment who were really critical. And so I just kind of absorbed this way of thinking and this way of understanding myself. But as an adult, I can decide, oh, that is really sad and kind of not necessary to be treating myself that way. And then I can start to build patterns of inner support or inner encouragement. And when I start building that, I mean, wherever we go, there we are, right? So that's something that I can obviously reach out for support outside of myself as well. But if we don't have it built inside, life is just a lot tougher. So then if we can start to build that through patterns of noticing how we relate to ourselves and practicing self-care and practicing different, I guess, accessing different regulating practices like meditation, mindfulness, yoga, some of those kinds of things that we've touched on before, I start to open up a space where I can move into that ventral energy. And that's that energy that I really need to be able to sit in order to find these things that we're talking about today.
Yeah, that notion of inner bullying is really profound. And what you said about, we're not able or particularly good at differentiating between external bullying and internal bullying. I think it's a huge concept. We probably could dedicate another podcast to that one specifically. But do people, are they able to off or access that calm nervous system energy if they're bullying themselves consistently? It seems like that would be impossible or nearly so.
Yeah, I mean, I think if it's probably all of us are going to have some like self-critical like thoughts that pop in, and then it's kind of like, do we feed them? Do we hop on a hamster wheel of shame? Like, what do we do when they pop in? Or do we kind of go, oh gosh, like I don't want to get caught in that way of thinking about myself. So if it's there, but we're aware of it and we can kind of shift out of it and into more constructive thought patterns, I think that's just called being human. Um, if, on the other hand, we're really caught in a pretty constant barrage of inner bullying messages or shame based patterns of thinking and living, uh, yeah, I think it kind of goes hand in hand with not being regulated.
Yeah, that's unfortunate, but yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Um, So I wanted to. I know we're just one more question here to kind of wrap it up. So we had this sort of who am I in conversation and talked about transitions and some of the things that we can do in those transitions to sort of stay regulated and calm and find really good, comforting, solid answers to that question. You know, for this next phase or this next chapter, who am I? I wanted to talk to you about. You had talked about sort of this transition with our kiddos and
Mm-hmm.
them moving on to college, and I was just curious, how do you see yourself kind of applying some of these principles, some of these concepts to yourself, and kind of what are you doing in that transition? And I'll qualify this and say, I know you said numerous times the answer or the prescription is not the same for everyone. But I'm just curious, what are you doing, and how are you navigating that?
Yeah, I guess by nature I'm a planner, and so and then I suppose my profession probably informs looking ahead a little bit. And so I think I've been anticipating that transition for a while, and kind of, I guess I'm such a visual person that a lot of times I'll sit and I'll think like, oh, what's this going to feel like in our house when it's just quieter and emptier and I don't have the boys moving through the space the same way and they're not needing as much from me and all of those kinds of things. Just like sitting with that and really kind of noticing what comes up inside of me. Is it lonely? Is it empty? Is it confused? Is it struggling to find meaning? Or is it an opportunity? And ooh, this gets kind of exciting. Like I could go try a whole bunch of new things. And so I think just sitting in that and noticing that there are different layers of meaning, of course, that are going to come up in those kinds of spaces in our life. And how do I take care of those different parts of myself as those transitions are taking place? And so I personally find comfort in kind of anticipating some of what I think I'll need in those places, and starting to try on ideas. They might be more conceptual than lived in that space because the reality is I'm still in this other chapter, right? So I don't want to abandon that chapter prematurely. I want to stay in it until the story has evolved to the point where there's the natural opening. But then when the natural opening comes in my system, I find comfort in kind of having some ideas about like, huh, yeah, I think I might go try that now, or I think this might be a useful unfolding in my life. And so, yeah, so I would say that's my answer. I don't know if it's fair for me to do this, but I think it's sometimes nice for our listeners to hear multiple perspectives. How about you?
I thought I was asking the question. So um, no, it's interesting. I think like you, I'm a planner, and you know, and I'm a fairly typical guy in the sense that I do a fair amount of compartmentalization, and so I kind of have that box and a set of like questions and solutions in that box, and then I just kind of live my life in other ways too. But I think what's happened for me is it was really conceptual for a long time. And then as we're getting closer, and now just as we record this, just less than a couple of months out, I think it's starting to get more tangible. And because it's on my radar in a bigger way, I'm just starting to do maybe in a little bit different way, probably not as sophisticated as your approach, but really starting to like play with those ideas of what will that feel like, what do I do with some of the extra time? How do I maintain the connection in ways that is gonna look different when they're not, sitting in the house and you just bump into them in the family room or whatever. So starting to just play out some of those practical things and trying to figure out. So we talk about sort of who am I, and asking that from an individual question, but then there's this sort of who are we type question, I think, as we transition, and what does that look like, the collective us, as we go in different directions. And so I don't know that that's a great answer, but I think I don't have a ton of solutions, but I'm starting to ask some of those questions and sort that out and come to grips with it. And I do better if I give myself a couple of months, if I have it, to kind of meditate on different answers. And so I'm in that phase where it's a mix of conscious and subconscious. I'm letting my subconscious do some of the work and try and sort some of that out.
Yeah. Everything you said just completely resonates with me in terms of the individual layers, but also the we kind of layers of the whole thing, and I guess even conversations that we have had as a family around that topic a little bit too. So, but at the end of the day, we're all sitting in the middle of those unknowns, feeling a little bit uncomfortable and trying to find our comfort with the discomfort, right? While we sit in the middle of life is lived in the questions. So,
yes.
Yeah. So that feels to me, I don't know about you, but maybe like a really great place to wrap up for today.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to do that. And so thanks everyone for joining. Really appreciate it. Hope that some of these ideas were helpful to you.
This podcast represents the opinions of Big Calm and our guests. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on our podcast does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Podcast content should not be taken as medical advice. All content is for informational purposes only. Please consult your healthcare professional with any medical questions. In no way does listening, reading, emailing, or interacting on social media with our content establish a doctor-patient or therapist-patient relationship. Privacy is of utmost importance to us. All people, places, and scenarios mentioned in the podcast have been changed to protect confidentiality. This podcast should not be used in any legal capacity whatsoever, including but not limited to establishing standard of care in a legal sense or as a basis for expert witness testimony. No guarantee is given regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast. The contents of our podcast and related show notes are all copyrighted content owned by Big Calm LLC. All podcasts and show notes that are distributed to the public for free can be redistributed via hard copy or electronic copy for free, only if Big Calm LLC is included as the acknowledged author within the actual media that is redistributed. This podcast is owned by Big Calm LLC.